Hello and welcome to a new episode of the West Asia Post with me, Ghadi Francis, our weekly show where we bring you your weekly dose of stories coming out of West Asia, one of the most turbulent regions of the world. Today we bring you to the heart of Beirut, where we are standing right now. Just about 2 months ago, this city was rocked with a massive blast. It was one of the largest explosions that the world had witnessed, and it was the largest explosion that Beirut has ever witnessed. It couldn't have come at a worse timing for Lebanon. This was only the tipping point for a country on the verge of collapse. Before we tell you more, here's a look at how the country's sectarian politics has now put its one and only lifeline at risk. On August 4, 2020, a warehouse in the port of Beirut caught fire. The fire spread and led to this. A massive explosion that rocked the city of Beirut. But the blast was only a tipping point for a city on the verge of collapse. Almost 2 months after the blast, Lebanon's politics has seen no major change, and this puts its only lifeline at risk. Lebanon was once ruled by France. The former colonial power has always enjoyed friendly relations with the country. But now the country's sectarian politics has put this lifeline at risk. Lebanon descended into further chaos after the resignation of Prime Minister-designate Mustafa Adib. Adib was picked on August 31st to deliver the country from the chaos it was caught in. After an intervention by French President Emmanuel Macron, under the French roadmap, the new government would tackle corruption and fix an economy crushed by massive debts. But the deadlock over demands by Lebanon's Shiite groups Amal and Hezbollah and the inability to deliver Beirut out of crisis meant that Adib's rise to power was short-lived. Adib's resignation was a blow to Macron's hopes for Lebanon. And he did not mince his words, even taking a swipe at Hezbollah.
What happened these past hours, these past days, is a fundamental clarification. The Lebanese political forces, their leaders, the leaders of Lebanese institutions did not want, clearly, resolutely, explicitly, did not want to respect the commitments made to France and the international community. They decided, and I am obliged to make a cruel observation for all of us, 1 month later, they decided to betray this commitment.
Describing the events of the last few days as betrayal, the French president gave the country's political leaders a deadline, holding off sanctions for now. But Macron's continuous intervention does not sit well with everyone in Lebanon. Hezbollah hit out at the French president, saying that he cannot act like the country's ruler. While the Shiite group remains ready for dialogue under the French roadmap to pull the nation out of financial crisis, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah asked the French leader to review what he called patronizing behavior.
We welcomed President Macron when he visited Lebanon, and we welcomed the French initiative. We welcomed the President Macron when he visited Lebanon, and we welcomed the French initiative, but not him acting as Attorney General, investigator, judge and ruler of Lebanon.
Long before the explosion, Lebanon's economy was in deep crisis. Poverty and unemployment were on the rise. Protesters took the streets of Lebanon calling for justice. And for the past several years, the country has been sliding into an economic depression. Our exclusive ground report from Lebanon tells you more about this. In Lebanon, this has become routine. This is the new norm. Banks use security forces now to make sure no blood is shed and their money is safe. It's a historical Ponzi scheme, said the French president. And it sure seems like one, given the prevalent conditions in Lebanon. If you are a Lebanese citizen with your life savings in a Lebanese bank, you are not entitled to your money in dollars. You are not entitled to use your cards outside of Lebanon. And what awaits you is a long line and wait, and the entitlement would not be more than $200 worth of Lebanese pounds. If your requirement is more, you have to bring in the legal papers to prove that you have an extraordinary reason to withdraw your own money. It gets worse. The Lebanese pound has three prices. The old price, $1,500 for $1, the bank price, $3,900 for $1, and the market price that fluctuates to reach $8,500 for $1. This is a simple articulation of the crisis. Here in Beirut, it's the story of who came first, the egg or the chicken, the political unrest or the economic collapse. It is a complicated issue that has been first described by the financial expert Dan Azzi years ago in numerous articles.
The problem in a nutshell in Lebanon is the negative balance of payment. It's a balance of payment deficit of dollars flowing out of the country because we are not an exporting country. We're primarily an importing country. So because of the lira peg, the peg to the lira at 1,500, this allowed the typical Lebanese person to have a purchasing power much higher than the productivity of the country. In the old days, this balance of payment deficit was covered through remittances, foreign direct investment, tourism, and all that reduced. At the same time, our standard of living, the GDP grew, which meant our import levels grew to the extent that it was no longer sustainable. So what the central bank did was a series of what he called financial engineering transactions, paying a humongous amount of interest to attract dollars into the country, except that these dollars were being spent not in anything productive, not in an investment, but they were being spent on funding imports or the lira peg. So effectively what the banks ran was a Ponzi scheme by paying old depositors through attracting new depositors. That's essentially a nutshell. So when the money ran out, essentially, so today we only have less than $20 billion of real dollars against a claim by depositors of about $120 billion. So everybody now is competing for those scarce dollars, the depositors as well as importers to run the electric grid, to buy medicine, to buy food. Everybody's competing for the same dollar.
Warlords, cartels and banks have been monitoring the lives of Lebanese people for years, but it all escalated exactly a year ago when the Lebanese uprising started. There was nothing to hide behind anymore.
Let me speak philosophically. In life there are problems that are virtual, man-made problems, and there are problems that are real. For example, the explosion that happened in the port, that's a real problem. Real people died, real people got wounded, houses were destroyed, businesses were destroyed. That's a real problem. The banking sector problem is virtual. It's fake money. It's a man-made construction. So the good news is that 95% of the problem in Lebanon is virtual, meaning that, and virtual problems have a virtual solution. You can solve it on a board. The correct solution is to take the losses. Wipe out all the claims, a significant chunk of the claims, which are debt. Mostly it's internal debt, by the way. Again, that's good news. So the good news also is that most of these claims are actually by a very small number of people. 6,000 depositors have more than 50% of the deposits at $1.90 billion.
So if these 6,000 depositors take the loss, Lebanon would be saved?
Lebanon will reach a floor below which it will not sink. So that means we can rise up from there slowly.
Some people await the US elections hoping for an American-Iranian agreement that would result in a truce and thus political stability. But truth be told, if the 6,000 rich people who got richer using the flawed system did not sacrifice, children's milk, patients' medicine, and the whole population will have to pay the price. President John Kennedy used to say, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. Here in Lebanon, no one expects politicians and cartels to give their country, but at least it is time for them to stop taking from it. But don't go anywhere, we have many more stories lined up for you. But first, let's take a look at the headlines we are tracking across the world right now.
Lebanon asks Interpol to detain 2 Russians over Beirut blast, including the captain and owner of the ship that transported thousands of tons of ammonium nitrate to Beirut. Thousands take to the streets of Iraq to mark the first anniversary of anti-government protests. Demonstrators demand employment and transparent elections. Jordan warns that it could be forced to return to a full lockdown, potentially devastating its fragile economy. This comes after the country witnesses an alarming rise in daily cases. United States slaps sanctions on 6 prominent Syrians and 11 entities connected to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says sanctions will not cease until the Assad regime ends campaign of violence against Syrian people.
The death of Jamal Khashoggi took the world by storm. The gruesome murder of the Saudi journalist on Turkish soil now directly involved 2 countries from West Asia that have always been in conflict with each other. While this story has been well documented across the world, pieces continue to remain missing till date. Our next report talks about how Khashoggi's death transformed the kingdom's image overnight and why calls for justice continue even after 2 years.
On October 2nd, 2018, Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi walked into his country's consulate in Istanbul. That was the last anyone ever saw of him. It all started with a threat by Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman almost a year before Khashoggi's murder. A report stated that the Saudi Crown Prince had said that he would use a bullet on Khashoggi. This threat came as a surprise to no one. While the 59-year-old was once close to the Saudi royal family, he fell out of favor in 2017, going into a self-imposed exile to the United States. Since then, he was writing a column in the Washington Post, where he regularly slammed the policies of Crown Prince bin Salman, Saudi Arabia's de facto ruler. Khashoggi first visited the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on 28 September 2018. He was last seen on CCTV footage entering the building at 13:14 local time. But he never came out. His fiancée, who was waiting outside, stood there for 10 hours. But there was no sight of Jamal Khashoggi. For 2 weeks, Saudi Arabia pretended to have no knowledge about Khashoggi's whereabouts. It was later found out that the journalist was brutally murdered. His body was reportedly dismembered and removed from the building. And his remains have not been found yet. This incident took the world by storm. It was seen as an attack on media freedom and unveiled the ugly and oppressive nature of the Saudi regime. In the months that followed, conflicting narratives about his death and who killed him emerged. While many believed it was the Crown Prince himself who ordered the hit, others said it was unlikely that bin Salman was involved. On 15th November that year, Saudi Arabia's deputy public prosecutor said that the murder was ordered by the head of a negotiations team sent to Istanbul by the Saudi deputy intelligence chief. The team was supposed to bring Khashoggi back to the kingdom by means of persuasion or by force. In January 2019, 11 individuals who have not been named were put on trial at the Criminal Court of Riyadh. In December 2019, the court sentenced 5 individuals to death. 3 others were handed prison sentences for covering up this crime and violating the law. While his fiancée found this verdict not acceptable, Khashoggi's son Salah, who lives in Saudi Arabia, said that justice had been served. Turkey was fuming over this murder on its soil. But President Recep Tayyip Erdogan never directly blamed the Saudi Crown Prince.
Aramasını yapıyor. Bütün bu çalışmalar devam ediyor.
Erdogan instead said that the order to murder Khashoggi came from the highest levels of the Saudi government. When the criticism got too much, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman had to publicly deny the killing.
بلا شك لا.
Absolutely not. This was a heinous crime. But I take full responsibility as a leader in Saudi Arabia, especially since it was committed by individuals working for the Saudi government.
A Saudi court overturned death sentences handed down to 5 defendants, sentencing them to 20 years in prison instead.
Merhum Jamal Khashoggi ile ilgili olarak
Turkey, on the other hand, has filed a second indictment against 6 more Saudi suspects. Istanbul prosecutors seek life imprisonment for 2 suspects and up to 5 years in jail for 4 others. While Khashoggi's murder is a story well documented over the last 2 years, many questions continue to remain unanswered. What happened to the body of the Saudi journalist? And who was ultimately responsible for his gruesome murder? West Asia Bureau, WION World is One.
Now moving on to Yemen. The 2 warring sides in the country's long conflict have decided to exchange prisoners, a move hailed as historic by many. But the question remains, will this prisoner swap truly mark history, or will it meet the same fate as earlier attempts?
While this might look like an ordinary piece of paper for many of us, these 5 signatures now mark history for Yemen, the witness to an agreement between the nation's 2 warring sides. Yemen's government and the Houthi rebels have agreed to exchange over 1,000 prisoners. This is the largest prisoner exchange program in the 5-year-long conflict. 1,081 prisoners, including 15 Saudi nationals, are part of the confidence-building measure.
As part of your commitment to release all conflict-related prisoners and detainees, including those covered by the Security Council resolutions.
Sources close to the deal say that rebels will release around 400 people, while the government will free 681 Houthi fighters. The announcement was made at a joint meeting in the Swiss village of Glion. The United Nations Special Envoy expects the move to pave the way for a national ceasefire.
This achievement here, I think, will undoubtedly have a bounce effect for that. That it will encourage the parties to go the extra mile to resolve final differences. So what we will be looking to do as a result of the announcement here today is in the coming days, very, very soon, from today, tomorrow, the next day, to go and visit the parties to finalize the specifics of that agreement. And it's important because it ends the war, but it also is important because it starts the process of building peace.
The International Committee of Red Cross, which will oversee this mammoth prisoner swap, called upon both parties to provide security and logistical guarantees for swift releases. The ICRC team is supposed to interview those released and provide them with medical checks.
The agreement on the list is a very positive step, but we call on all parties to continue with the same urgency towards agreeing on phasing of legs, as well as require security and logistical guarantees for this operation to move from signature to reality.
While Yemen's Foreign Minister Mohammed al-Hadrami lauded this humanitarian breakthrough, he demanded for the agreement to be implemented without any stalling. Though the mammoth prisoner swap deal is an achievement on its own, it's not the first one that the two sides have agreed upon. In 2018, the Yemeni government and the Houthi movement signed a deal to swap some 15,000 detainees. Till date, that pact has only been partially implemented. This deal comes at a time when Yemen has been described as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Mired in conflict since 2014, it all started when the Houthi rebels removed the internationally recognized government in power. Since then, the war in the West Asian country has killed over 100,000 people, leaving millions suffering from food and medical shortages. West Asia Bureau, WION. World is One.
September 28th marked 20 years since the start of Palestine's second intifada. An uprising sparked after then Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon stormed Al-aqsa mosque compound in East Jerusalem. This triggered years of conflict, leaving thousands of Palestinians dead. We take a look at the history of this mass uprising and what it means for Palestinians in 2020.
It's been 2 decades since the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon entered the Al-aqsa compound. The sight of a right-wing Israeli politician in the third holiest site of Islam sparked a major Palestinian uprising, Intifada. But what does Intifada mean? Intifada is an Arabic word which means to shake off. It is used to refer to the Palestinian uprising against Israeli occupation. There have been 2 intifadas since the creation of Israel. In December 1987, when Israeli army trucks collided with a car in the Jubilee refugee camp in Gaza, 4 Palestinians were killed, triggering mass protests. By the end of the first intifada in 1993, more than 1,000 Palestinians lost their lives, while 16,000 people had been imprisoned. 50 Israeli civilians had also been killed. The second intifada, also referred to as Al-aqsa intifada, was even bloodier. It started in 2000, after Israeli leader Ariel Sharon walked into the Al-aqsa mosque with his security guards. A fight broke out between worshippers and Sharon's security guards. 7 Palestinians were killed.
No one here expects the organizers of the Arab uprising to ask the Israelis for anything less than a total withdrawal from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
Within just 2 days, the revolt gained momentum and more than 900 Israelis and at least 4,000 Palestinians had been killed. And when it ended, 5 years later, it left Palestinians with a separation war. But will the anniversary of Second Intifada be the beginning of the third? Nidal Nagy Turkiman spent 17 years in an Israeli prison for his role in the Second Intifada. He says that for the Palestinians, the situation is now even bleaker.
The political horizon is shutting down. There is a regional, Arab, international and Israeli political blockade to pressure the Palestinian leadership to give up the rights of Palestinians. We consider the Palestinian issue quintessentially a political one.
The leader of the Palestinian group Islamic Jihad Base Camp says that his own group may take matters into their own hands after US President Donald Trump declared Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And some say it could lead to a third Palestinian intifada.
We expect another mass uprising or intifada to happen at any moment for a specific period of time. This will not stop as long as there is occupation, as long as there is a daily pressure on these people and a continuous targeting of their land and holy sites.
While Israel looms large in discussions, many young Palestinians are also frustrated by the actions of their own leaders, plagued by years of infighting that has undermined young people's faith in political action. Since the Second Intifada ended in 2005, life for Palestinians has gradually become worse.
I am from Jenin camp, from the incursion, when the Jews hit up and damaged our home. I have no room, no parents except my God.
In the 15 years since, many Jewish settlers followed Sharon and entered the Al-aqsa compound under police escort. Israel has also built new settlements along the occupied West Bank. The talk of further annexations are becoming louder. None of these have led to another uprising, despite what some Palestinians and leaders may expect. There might not be a third intifada anytime soon. West Asia Bureau, WION. World is One.
That's all we have for you for this week's episode of the West Asia Post. I will see you next week with a brand new lineup, bringing you more stories from the world's most volatile region. Until then, stay home and stay safe. This is Ghadi Francis, and you are watching WION. World is One.